February 17, 1943, 8:06:15 hours, Bataan Peninsula, Philippines. Staff Sergeant Michael Mad Dog Sullivan crouched behind the twisted wreckage of a burned-out M3 Stuart tank, his Thompson submachine gun nearly empty, and his left shoulder bleeding from shrapnel. Around him, the remnants of the 192nd Tank Battalion were being systematically overrun by elements of the Japanese 14th Army. The acrid smell of burning oil mixed with cordite and the metallic stench of blood filled his nostrils as he watched his brothers in arms fall one by one to superior numbers and fresh supplies. 3 months had passed since Pearl Harbor, and the writing was on the wall for American forces in the Philippines. MacArthur had already been evacuated to Australia, leaving behind 76 American and Filipino troops to face an impossible situation with dwindling ammunition, no air support, and disease spreading through their ranks like wildfire. Sullivan checked his ammunition one more time. 7 rounds left. He could hear the Japanese voices getting closer, their Type 99 rifles cracking through the jungle like deadly punctuation marks in a conversation he was about to lose. What happened next would defy every manual ever written about prisoner survival, and it would haunt the nightmares of Japanese soldiers for the remainder of the war. The mathematics of Sullivan's situation were brutal in their simplicity. Born in South Boston to Irish immigrants, he had enlisted in the Army in 1940. At age 22, driven by a combination of economic necessity and a desire to see the world beyond the narrow streets of Southie. His father had died in a factory accident when Michael was 16, leaving him responsible for his mother and 3 younger sisters. The Army offered steady pay, 3 meals a day, and the promise of adventure. What it delivered was 18 months of intensive training in armored warfare at Fort Knox, Kentucky, followed by deployment to the Philippines as part of the massive military buildup authorized by Congress in 1941. The 192nd Tank Battalion had arrived in Manila in September 1941, just 2 months before the Japanese attack that would change everything. Sullivan had distinguished himself as a tank commander, earning his stripes through a combination of mechanical aptitude, tactical awareness, and an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under fire. His crew called him Mad Dog, not because he was reckless, but because he seemed to enter a state of focused intensity during combat that made him appear almost feral in his efficiency. The Japanese had been methodically dismantling American defenses for weeks. Their 25th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita, had perfected the art of jungle warfare through years of fighting in China and Southeast Asia. They moved through the dense Filipino rainforest like ghosts, appearing where American commanders least expected them and disappearing before effective counterattacks could be organized. American tanks, designed for European battlefields, struggled with the muddy terrain and thick vegetation that channeled them into predictable killing zones. Japanese anti-tank teams, armed with Type 140 anti-tank guns and magnetic mines, had turned every jungle path into a potential graveyard for American armor. Sullivan's tank, a 12-ton M3 Stuart nicknamed Boston Strong by his crew, had survived longer than most through a combination of careful positioning, aggressive maintenance, and pure luck. But luck was a finite resource in war, and Sullivan's was running out fast. The attack had begun at dawn with a barrage of Type 91 105 millimeter howitzer shells that turned the American defensive positions into a moonscape of craters and twisted metal. Sullivan's tank had taken a direct hit to its rear engine compartment, killing his driver instantly and setting the vehicle ablaze. He had managed to drag his wounded gunner clear of the wreckage before the ammunition started cooking off. But they had been separated in the chaos that followed. Now, Sullivan found himself alone, surrounded by advancing Japanese infantry who were calling for his surrender in broken English, mixed with threatening gestures that needed no translation. Japanese military doctrine regarding prisoners was clear and unforgiving. The Bushido Code demanded death before dishonor, and many Japanese officers viewed American willingness to surrender as evidence of moral weakness that deserved nothing but contempt. Reports from other captured American positions spoke of prisoners being used for bayonet practice, forced to dig their own graves, or simply shot where they stood. Sullivan had no illusions about what capture would mean, but as the Japanese soldiers closed in, their Type 38 rifles trained on his position, Sullivan made a calculation that would define the rest of his life. Instead of fighting to the last bullet and dying in a blaze of glory, he slowly raised his hands and allowed himself to be taken prisoner. It was not cowardice that motivated this decision, but rather a cold assessment of his options and a plan that was already forming in his mind. He had studied Japanese military tactics extensively during his training, and he knew that prisoners were often consolidated at temporary holding areas before being transported to permanent camps. If he could stay alive long enough to reach one of these consolidation points, he might find an opportunity to escape that would be impossible to create while surrounded by an entire army in active combat. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only gamble available to a man who refused to accept defeat as his final answer. If you want to discover how a captured American soldier turned the tables on his captors using nothing but 15 feet of communications wire and pure rage, please leave your like on this video. This helps us share more forgotten stories like this one with people who understand that real heroism often comes from the most unlikely places. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, to not miss the next episodes where we rescue these incredible stories from dusty archives. The Japanese soldiers who captured Sullivan were part of the 16th Division's 20th Infantry Regiment, battle-hardened veterans who had fought through the Philippines campaign with ruthless efficiency. Their commanding officer, Captain Hiroshi Yamamoto, was a career military man who had graduated from the Imperial Japanese Army Academy in 1935 and had served with distinction in the Second Sino-Japanese War. Yamamoto spoke passable English, having spent 2 years as a military attaché in San Francisco before the war, and he viewed American prisoners with a mixture of professional curiosity and cultural disdain. He ordered Sullivan bound with communications wire, his hands tied behind his back with the kind of methodical precision that spoke of extensive experience with prisoner handling. The wire cut into Sullivan's wrists as the circulation slowly stopped, but he forced himself to remain perfectly still and compliant. Any sign of resistance now would result in immediate execution, and he needed these men to see him as a defeated enemy who posed no further threat. The temporary holding area was established in a bombed-out Filipino schoolhouse approximately 2 miles behind the front lines. Japanese military doctrine called for rapid processing of prisoners to extract tactical intelligence while it remained current and useful. Sullivan was forced to sit cross-legged on the concrete floor of what had once been a classroom, his back against a wall covered with children's drawings that seemed grotesquely cheerful in the current context. Around him, 17 other American prisoners sat in similar positions, their faces bearing the hollow-eyed expression of men who had seen too much and expected too little. Most were enlisted men from various Army units, but Sullivan noticed a Navy pilot whose flight suit bore the insignia of VF-3 Fighting Squadron, and a Marine gunnery sergeant whose weathered face suggested years of service in places most people couldn't pronounce. The interrogation process was systematic and brutal. Captain Yamamoto had brought along a specialist, Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka, whose particular expertise lay in extracting information from reluctant prisoners through a combination of psychological pressure and carefully applied physical persuasion. Tanaka was a small man, barely 5 feet 6 inches tall, but his reputation preceded him like a dark cloud. American intelligence reports described him as the architect of interrogation techniques that had broken some of the toughest Marine and Army officers captured in the early months of the Pacific War. His method relied not on random violence, but on the precise application of pain and humiliation designed to strip away military discipline and leave his subjects desperate to please their captors in any way possible. Sullivan watched and learned as Tanaka worked his way through the other prisoners. The lieutenant's technique involved identifying each prisoner's psychological weak points through careful observation and questioning, then exploiting those vulnerabilities with surgical precision. He spoke English fluently, having studied at UCLA before the war, and he used this linguistic ability to create false intimacy with his subjects. He would begin each session by asking seemingly innocent questions about hometown, family, and peacetime occupation, gradually building a profile of what each man valued most. Then he would use that information to craft threats and promises specifically designed to break down resistance. A young private from Iowa found himself facing detailed descriptions of what Japanese soldiers would do to his family farm. A corporal from Detroit was told that his wife had been informed of his death and was already remarrying. The psychological warfare was as effective as any physical torture, leaving grown men sobbing and begging for mercy. But when Tanaka reached Sullivan, he encountered something unexpected. The staff sergeant answered questions with mechanical precision, providing only name, rank, and service number as required by the Geneva Convention. When Tanaka pressed for tactical information about American defensive positions, Sullivan simply repeated his basic identifying information in a monotone voice that betrayed no emotion whatsoever. When the lieutenant tried to establish psychological leverage by asking about family back home, Sullivan's response was always the same. Sullivan, Michael J. Staff Sergeant, 37-429-861. The repetition was maddening, and Tanaka found himself becoming increasingly frustrated with his inability to crack this particular prisoner. What the Japanese officer didn't realize was that Sullivan was using the interrogation as an opportunity to study his captors, noting their weapons, their positioning, their habits, and their psychological state. The Japanese guards were tired and overconfident. They had been fighting continuously for weeks, surviving on minimal sleep and maximum adrenaline, and the easy capture of this group of Americans had led them to relax their vigilance to dangerous levels. They kept their weapons slung rather than at ready position. They talked loudly among themselves, revealing information about troop movements and supply situations. Most importantly, they had developed a routine that Sullivan could predict and potentially exploit. Every evening at exactly 1900 hours, they would gather around a small fire in the schoolyard to prepare their evening meal of rice and canned fish. During this 30-minute period, only 2 guards remained inside the building with the prisoners, and these guards consistently positioned themselves near the front entrance where they could watch the courtyard while maintaining visual contact with their captives. How many of you had a grandfather, father, or uncle who served and never talked about what he experienced? These stories are disappearing. Leave a comment right now saying just, "My grandfather served," or "My father served." When you comment, you're not just honoring your family, you're preserving memory for the next generations. Let's create a living memorial here in the comments. On February 23rd, 6 days after his capture, Sullivan received the opportunity he had been waiting for. During the evening meal preparation, one of the interior guards made a critical mistake. Private First Class Yoshiro Sato, a 19-year-old farm boy from rural Japan who had been conscripted just 8 months earlier, decided to visit the latrine while his partner remained at the front entrance. This left Corporal Ichiro Nakamura alone with 18 American prisoners in a room with 3 potential exits and dozens of improvised weapons. Nakamura was experienced enough to know that this was a dangerous situation, but fatigue and routine had dulled his edge to the point where he failed to recognize the immediate threat. He positioned himself with his back to the room's side window, his Type 38 rifle held casually across his lap while he ate rice from a metal bowl. The positioning was tactically disastrous because it prevented him from maintaining full visual contact with all prisoners while simultaneously blocking his own escape route. Sullivan had spent 6 days loosening the communications wire that bound his wrists. The constant slight movements, disguised as normal, shifting to relieve cramped muscles, had gradually stretched the wire enough to create minimal slack. More importantly, he had discovered that the wire had developed a sharp burr where it had been twisted during installation, and careful manipulation had positioned this burr against the binding in a way that allowed him to slowly fray the metal strands. The work was painful and tedious, leaving his wrists bloody and raw, but it was performed with the methodical patience of a man whose life depended on precision timing. By the evening of the 23rd, Sullivan calculated that he could free his hands within 30 seconds if he was willing to accept significant injury to his wrists and forearms. When Private Sato left for the latrine, Sullivan began his final preparations. He positioned his feet for maximum leverage and took 3 deep breaths to oxygenate his blood for the explosive effort that would follow. The other prisoners sensed that something was about to happen, and several men began shifting position to provide concealment for whatever Sullivan was planning. The Marine Gunnery Sergeant, a tough veteran named Walsh, who had been watching Sullivan with professional interest for days, gave an almost imperceptible nod that said he was ready to provide support if needed. The Navy pilot, Lieutenant Commander Richardson, began coughing loudly to mask any noise Sullivan might make during his escape attempt. Even the young private from Iowa, despite his earlier breakdown under interrogation, positioned himself to block Corporal Nakamura's view of Sullivan's position. At exactly 1912 hours, Sullivan made his move. He yanked his hands apart with enough force to drive the wire burr completely through his right wrist, opening a gash that immediately began spurting blood, but also freeing his hands for the first time in 6 days. The pain was excruciating, but it was also liberating in a way that filled him with savage joy. Before Corporal Nakamura could react to the sudden movement, Sullivan had rolled forward and grabbed the 15 feet of communications wire that had been coiled near the classroom's broken radiator. Japanese soldiers routinely salvaged such items for field telephone repairs, and this particular length of wire had been sitting in plain sight for 3 days without anyone recognizing its potential as a weapon. In Sullivan's hands, it became something far more dangerous than any bayonet or rifle. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. Sullivan moved with the fluid precision of a man who had spent months training in close-quarters combat. But there was also something primal and unleashed in his movements that went beyond military training. Corporal Nakamura tried to bring his rifle to bear, but Sullivan was already inside his defensive perimeter, the wire forming a loop that settled around the Japanese soldier's neck with deadly efficiency. The struggle lasted less than 15 seconds, but it was 15 seconds of absolute violence that left Nakamura dead and Sullivan in possession of a loaded Type 38 rifle with 42 rounds of ammunition. The sound of the brief struggle had been masked by Lieutenant Commander Richardson's continued coughing and the noise of meal preparation in the courtyard, giving Sullivan precious seconds to prepare for what would happen next. Private Sato returned from the latrine at exactly 1914 hours, expecting to find his partner eating rice and maintaining watch over the prisoners. Instead, he found 18 Americans free of their bonds, and Staff Sergeant Sullivan standing near the doorway with Corporal Nakamura's rifle trained on the entrance. Sato had enough time to register the scene and reach for his own weapon before Sullivan's first shot took him center mass, driving him backward into the courtyard where his death cry alerted the remaining guards to the situation. The escape had officially begun, and both sides understood that it would end with either Sullivan's death or the elimination of every Japanese soldier in the immediate area. There would be no surrender, no negotiation, and no mercy from either side. The firefight that followed lasted exactly 45 seconds and resulted in 21 Japanese casualties. Sullivan's advantage lay not in superior firepower, but in superior positioning and the element of surprise. The Japanese soldiers in the courtyard were focused on their evening meal and had stacked their weapons in a central location for security, rather than keeping them immediately accessible. This meant that when Sullivan's shots began echoing through the evening air, most of the guards needed precious seconds to reach their rifles and return fire. Sullivan used those seconds to devastating effect, firing rapidly and accurately at targets who were silhouetted against the cooking fire and had nowhere to take cover except behind inadequate wooden structures that offered concealment but no real protection from rifle fire. The Type 38 rifle Sullivan had captured was an excellent weapon for this type of close-range engagement. Chambered in 6.5 by 50mm Arisaka, it was accurate, reliable, and produced relatively mild recoil that allowed for rapid follow-up shots. Sullivan's training with similar bolt-action rifles during his time at Fort Knox served him well as he worked the action with mechanical precision, placing shots with the kind of accuracy that spoke of countless hours on the rifle range. His first magazine eliminated 4 guards who were attempting to reach their weapons. His second magazine caught 3 soldiers who were trying to flank his position through the schoolhouse's rear entrance. By the time he began his third magazine, the surviving Japanese were in full retreat toward their main encampment, leaving behind their dead and wounded in their haste to escape this unexpected reversal of fortune. But Sullivan wasn't finished. The savage joy that had filled him during his initial escape had transformed into something colder and more calculating. He knew that any Japanese soldiers who escaped would return with reinforcements, and he had no intention of giving them that opportunity. Using hand signals learned during infantry training, he organized the freed prisoners into a pursuit team that would track down and eliminate the fleeing guards before they could raise an alarm. The other Americans, despite their ordeal, responded to Sullivan's leadership with the disciplined efficiency of trained soldiers who understood that their survival depended on completing this mission successfully. They stripped weapons and ammunition from the Japanese dead, formed into fire teams, and began a systematic hunt that would ensure no enemy survivors reached friendly lines. The pursuit lasted through the night and covered approximately 3 miles of jungle terrain. Sullivan's knowledge of Japanese military tactics, combined with tracking skills learned during childhood hunting trips in the Massachusetts woods, allowed him to predict the likely escape routes and position his teams for maximum effectiveness. The Japanese soldiers, trained for offensive operations rather than defensive retreats, made numerous tactical errors that cost them their lives. They moved too quickly, leaving clear tracks in the soft jungle soil. They failed to establish proper security halts, allowing the Americans to approach within killing distance undetected. Most critically, they bunched together for mutual support rather than spreading out, making themselves vulnerable to concentrated fire from multiple directions. By dawn, all 21 Japanese soldiers from the original guard detail were dead, and Sullivan's group had acquired enough weapons and ammunition to arm themselves for the long journey back to American lines. The escape and subsequent firefight had profound psychological effects on both sides. For the Americans, it provided proof that Japanese soldiers were not the invincible warriors that enemy propaganda portrayed them to be. Sullivan's success demonstrated that careful planning, proper timing, and aggressive execution could overcome superior numbers and defensive positions. Word of the escape spread through American units via informal communication networks, providing a morale boost at a time when good news was desperately needed. For the Japanese, Sullivan's escape represented a significant intelligence failure that resulted in immediate changes to prisoner handling procedures. Captain Yamamoto, who had been responsible for the security of the temporary holding area, committed seppuku rather than face the disgrace of explaining how 18 American prisoners had vanished along with an entire guard detail. Lieutenant Tanaka survived the war, but never again achieved the same effectiveness as an interrogator, having lost confidence in his ability to assess and control enemy personnel. The journey back to American lines took Sullivan's group 11 days and covered nearly 60 miles of jungle terrain. They moved primarily at night, navigating by stars and using streams to mask their tracks from pursuing Japanese patrols. Food consisted of whatever they could forage or capture from isolated enemy positions, supplemented by emergency rations taken from Japanese supply caches. Medical care was limited to basic first aid, using captured supplies and improvised techniques learned from field manuals. Sullivan's wounded wrist became infected despite treatment, but he refused to allow the injury to slow the group's movement or compromise their security. His leadership during this period cemented his reputation among the other escapees as a man who could be trusted to make the hard decisions necessary for survival. They reached American lines on March 6, 1943, crossing into the defensive perimeter of the 31st Infantry Regiment near Bagak. The reunion was emotional and chaotic, with Sullivan's group initially mistaken for Japanese infiltrators due to their ragged appearance and possession of enemy weapons. Only after extended interrogation and verification of their identities were they accepted as legitimate American personnel and evacuated to medical facilities in Australia. Sullivan's debrief took 3 days and provided American intelligence with valuable information about Japanese interrogation techniques, security procedures, and tactical capabilities. His report led to immediate changes in American survival training and escape procedures that would save countless lives throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. Staff Sergeant Michael Sullivan's post-war life reflected the complex psychological aftermath of extreme combat trauma. He was medically evacuated to Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, D.C., where he spent 4 months recovering from his physical injuries and undergoing evaluation for what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The Army awarded him the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions during the escape, making him one of the youngest enlisted men to receive the nation's second highest decoration for valor. But the recognition came with a price that would follow him for the rest of his life. Sullivan struggled with survivors' guilt over the men who had died during the initial Japanese attack, and he was haunted by nightmares that recreated the violence of his escape in vivid and terrifying detail. He returned to South Boston in August 1943, but found civilian life almost impossible to navigate. The skills that had kept him alive in the Philippines seemed useless in a world of factory jobs and family obligations. He married his childhood sweetheart, Mary O'Brien, in September 1944. But the marriage was troubled from the beginning by his inability to discuss his wartime experiences and her difficulty understanding the man who had returned in place of the boy she remembered. They had 3 children together, but Sullivan remained emotionally distant from his family, unable to connect with people who had no reference point for understanding what he had endured. He worked a series of blue-collar jobs, never staying in one place long enough to establish roots or build the kind of stable life that his family needed and deserved. The nightmares never stopped. Even 40 years after the war ended, Sullivan would wake up fighting invisible enemies, his hands automatically reaching for weapons that weren't there. He rarely spoke about his military service, and when he did, it was in fragments that revealed nothing about the true nature of his experiences. His children learned about their father's heroism from newspaper articles and military historians rather than from Sullivan himself, who seemed determined to bury the past as deeply as possible. He attended some veterans' reunions but found them more painful than comforting, surrounded by men who wanted to relive experiences that he was desperately trying to forget. The easy camaraderie of military service proved impossible to recreate in civilian life, leaving Sullivan feeling isolated and misunderstood. Lieutenant Commander Richardson, the Navy pilot who had helped mask Sullivan's initial escape, went on to become a commercial airline captain and remained in contact with Sullivan through letters and occasional visits. He often spoke about Sullivan's leadership during their escape as the defining experience of his own military career, crediting the staff sergeant with saving not only his life, but his faith in American fighting spirit. Gunnery Sergeant Walsh returned to the Marines and served with distinction in Korea before retiring as a Master Sergeant. He nominated Sullivan for the Medal of Honor in 1951, but the nomination was rejected due to lack of supporting documentation from Japanese sources. The other survivors of the escape scattered across the country after the war, but they maintained informal contact through holiday cards and occasional reunions that gradually became funeral gatherings as age and illness took their toll. Sullivan's escape had lasting effects on Japanese military doctrine and prisoner handling procedures. The loss of an entire guard detail to escape prisoners was considered so catastrophic that it resulted in immediate policy changes throughout the Japanese Imperial Army. Security procedures were tightened to prevent similar incidents, with multiple guard teams and redundant security measures becoming standard practice at all prisoner holding facilities. Interrogation techniques were modified to reduce the time between capture and permanent detention, minimizing opportunities for escape planning. Most significantly, the psychological impact of Sullivan's success led to increased paranoia among Japanese commanders regarding American capabilities and determination. Reports of the escape were classified and suppressed to prevent damage to morale, but word spread through informal channels and contributed to growing Japanese concerns about their ability to maintain control over captured territory. The weapons and equipment captured during Sullivan's escape provided American intelligence with valuable insights into Japanese military capabilities and manufacturing quality. The Type 38 rifles were found to be well made, but showed signs of material shortages that suggested growing strain on Japanese industrial capacity. Ammunition analysis revealed powder compositions that indicated changes in Japanese explosive manufacturing, providing clues about resource availability and strategic priorities. Personal items taken from Japanese casualties included letters home that, when translated, revealed information about unit designations, troop movements, and morale conditions within the Japanese Imperial Army. This intelligence proved valuable in planning future operations and understanding Japanese strategic capabilities as the war progressed. The schoolhouse, where Sullivan was held prisoner, was recaptured by American forces during the liberation of the Philippines in 1945. Military investigators found evidence of the firefight in the form of bullet holes and bloodstains, but Japanese efforts to conceal the incident meant that official records contained no mention of the escape or the subsequent casualties. The building was eventually demolished during post-war reconstruction, but local Filipino residents preserved stories about the American soldiers who had fought there. A small memorial marker was placed on the site in 1995, honoring all American prisoners who had died in Japanese captivity during the war. Sullivan's name appears on the marker, along with the other members of his original tank crew, though he was the only one who lived to see the war's end. Sullivan died of a heart attack in 1987 at the age of 69, having never fully recovered from the psychological wounds inflicted during his wartime service. His funeral was attended by 3 of his fellow escapees, along with representatives from numerous veterans organizations who recognized his contributions to American military history. He was buried in Mount Benedict Cemetery in West Roxbury, Massachusetts, with full military honors, including a 21-gun salute that seemed to echo the violence that had defined his young adulthood. His gravestone bears a simple inscription: Staff Sergeant Michael J. Sullivan, 102nd Tank Battalion, Distinguished Service Cross. He did not surrender. The words capture both his greatest triumph and his greatest burden, reflecting a life defined by a moment of extraordinary courage that could never be forgotten or fully understood by those who had not shared the experience. The legacy of Sullivan's escape extends far beyond the immediate military consequences of his actions. His story became part of the oral tradition of American Special Operations Forces, taught in survival schools as an example of how proper preparation and aggressive action can overcome seemingly impossible odds. Modern military training incorporates lessons learned from Sullivan's experience, emphasizing the importance of maintaining situational awareness even in captivity and the potential for escape opportunities to arise when enemies become complacent. His techniques for loosening restraints, organizing fellow prisoners, and conducting pursuit operations are still studied by military personnel who may find themselves in similar situations. The psychological aspects of Sullivan's story have also contributed to better understanding of combat trauma and prisoner of war experiences. His post-war struggles with adjustment and family relationships reflect patterns that are now recognized as typical responses to extreme stress and violence. Mental health professionals study cases like Sullivan's to develop better treatment approaches for combat veterans, acknowledging that physical survival of combat does not necessarily ensure psychological recovery. The disconnect between public recognition of heroism and private struggles with trauma has become a central theme in veteran support programs designed to address the whole person rather than just the military service record. Sullivan's story proves that sometimes the most powerful weapon available to a soldier is the refusal to accept defeat as the final answer to an impossible situation. His escape demonstrates that careful observation, patient preparation, and aggressive execution can overcome superior numbers and defensive advantages when applied with precision timing and unwavering determination. Most importantly, his experience illustrates that true heroism often comes not from fearless bravery, but from the ability to function effectively despite overwhelming fear, finding ways to complete the mission even when survival seems impossible. If this story moved you the same way it moved us, do us a favor, leave your like on this video. Every like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every day. Stories about soldiers who refused to surrender, prisoners who turned the tables on their captors, men who changed the course of history through courage and determination. Real people, real heroism. Leave a comment now and tell us where you're watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, Philippines. Our community extends around the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just tell us you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for ensuring that Michael Sullivan doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that possible. Note: this content combines documented historical information about prisoner of war experiences and escape attempts during World War II with dramatized elements for educational and entertainment purposes. While based on real events and authentic military procedures, specific details have been enhanced for narrative engagement.